Magnificent Delusions by Husain Haqqani continued. The Americans were equally frustrated when they tried to get the Indians to agree to a joint India-Pakistan agreement on the non-use and non-development of nuclear weapons. Indian Prime Minister Morarji Desai told the US Ambassador to India, Robert Goheen, that he had already made a pledge to that effect. If the United States could get Pakistan to do the same, the two pledges would be as good as a joint agreement, he argued. Desai also said that if he discovered that Pakistan was ready to test a bomb, or if it exploded one, India would act to smash it. Zia had two messages for two audiences. In pursuit of American aid, he told the New York Times that Pakistan is not making a bomb. He also insisted that Pakistan is not in a position to make a bomb and has no intention of making a bomb. But in order not to disappoint Pakistanis and others in the Muslim world who wanted Pakistan to go nuclear, he confirmed reports that Pakistan had embarked on a program to produce enriched uranium, saying, "Pakistan is close to it, if we have not already acquired the technology of making enriched uranium." The game of hide-and-seek over Pakistan's nuclear weapons program continued for almost 2 decades. Pakistan's leaders, notably Zia, defined Pakistan's nuclear capability as a shared asset for all Muslims. But in later years, Pakistanis expressed indignation over the Western media describing the Pakistani bomb as the Islamic bomb. The Carter administration initially paid little attention to Pakistan's jihad in Afghanistan, as it was preoccupied with the fast-moving events in Iran. Pakistan's nuclear program was also a major irritant. But Zia did not give up. He sought American attention for Pakistan through a series of interviews with the US media. "The Soviet Union is now sitting on our borders," Zia told Sig Gisler of the Milwaukee Journal soon after Carter's inauguration. He recalled Pakistan's role in bridging the relations between China and the United States. "Has the free world any interest left in Pakistan?" he asked, insisting that the country could still be a bastion of US policy. "The USA has never been able to stand by its allies," he said in another interview with CBS. "They have always let them down." Zia's solicitations led the CIA to decide that it could use Pakistan's services in dealing with the operational fallout of the Iranian Revolution. Tehran had been the center of a huge network of American spies in the Middle East and Central Asia, but many of the CIA's human intelligence assets had to be moved out of Iran to safety. The CIA had also lost its listening post in Iran. When US officials contacted Zia for collaboration in the collection of communications intelligence, he readily agreed. But he sought a greater role for the ISI in all operations. Many Iranians with American connections moved out of their country through Pakistani Baluchistan and onward through Karachi. The CIA also worked with Pakistani intelligence to improve Pakistan's electronic intercept capabilities. Zia insisted that, to cover Pakistan's tracks, the number of American intelligence specialists in the country be kept to a minimum. The CIA had to deal extensively with the ISI to access data that American intercept installations had collected. The Iranian connection formed a closer bond between the CIA and ISI than before. Zia then made a strong pitch for US involvement in Pakistan's Afghan project. Together, he argued, the United States and Pakistan could help roll back communism in Afghanistan and diminish Soviet prestige. American journalists were invited to report on the training program for anti-communist Afghan guerrillas, even though Islamabad officially denied the program's existence. The Washington Post reported that at least 2,000 Afghans were being trained at Pakistani bases, guarded by Pakistani troops. Anti-communist hardliners were Zia's target audience in Washington. Pakistan had recruited Afghan Islamist warriors in its effort to finally end the notion of Pashtunistan, but Zia wanted the Americans to believe that this was part of their ideological struggle against global communism. A breakthrough for Zia came when, in July 1979, Carter approved a modest program of CIA assistance to the Afghan Islamist resistance, routed through Pakistan. Zia had already convinced the Saudis to join his project. Saudi intelligence officials raised with their US counterparts the prospect of defeating the communists in Afghanistan. The CIA's Directorate of Operations reported that the Saudis could be expected to fund and encourage the Pakistanis. Other governments could also be expected to join in. At one meeting of US officials dealing with national security, Defense Department official Walter Slocum asked if there was value in keeping the Afghan insurgency going, sucking the Soviets into a Vietnamese quagmire. The Americans also weighed the risk of provoking the Soviets before initiating covert support for the Pakistani project. For years, the conventional narrative about the war in Afghanistan has revolved around the Soviet invasion in December 1979. But Carter signed the first authorization to help the Mujahideen covertly on July 3, 1979, almost 6 months before the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And Pakistan had been recruiting and training the Mujahideen for years before that. Americans like to believe that the war in Afghanistan was Charlie Wilson's war. In fact, however, it was Zia-ul-Haq's war, which the Americans expanded with their money and sophisticated weapons. Carter's first authorization only covered support for insurgent propaganda and other psychological operations in Afghanistan, establishment of radio access to the Afghan population through third country facilities, and the provision, either unilaterally or through third countries, of support to the Afghan insurgents in the form of either cash or non-military supplies. A little over $500,000 was allocated. All of it was drawn within 6 weeks. The US Embassy in Kabul made a feeble attempt to alert Washington about the retrograde beliefs of its new Afghan allies. The available manifesto, issued by some opposition groups, calls for a social and economic system based on the fundamentalist tenets of Islam, an embassy cable stated. An opposition-led regime would probably not have social and economic reforms so necessary for this backward country high on its priority list. It also warned that if successful, the Mujahideen would probably carry out thousands of personal vendettas against officials serving in the communist regime. The Americans got another warning about the perils of partnership with Pakistan when Islamist students burned down the embassy in Islamabad on November 21, 1979. The students were reacting to rumors that the United States was responsible for the seizure of Islam's holiest shrine, the Grand Mosque in Makkah. Several embassy officials were trapped in the burning building, resulting in the death of 4 people, including 2 Americans. The Pakistan military took 4 hours to arrive at the site and several more to restore order. Some Americans and some Western diplomats maintained that the police here stood by for several hours without challenging the irate crowd, the New York Times reported the next day. Among the Americans who lived through the violence, there was not much gratitude for the police or the Pakistan army, the paper said. Its reporter also did not find much contrition among Pakistanis. A group of 50 students marched at Rawalpindi the next day to honor one of the demonstrators who had been killed. Zia's cabinet expressed its understanding for the enraged sentiments of the Muslims in Pakistan, even though it regretted its inappropriate and irresponsible expression. Hummel, for his part, avoided direct comment on the government's inadequate and delayed response in protecting the embassy. He said that the judgment of whether Pakistan bore some responsibility for the US embassy's destruction would have to be made in Washington. This reflected the Islamists' potential for anti-American violence and the government's sympathy with their sentiment. US diplomats wondered why the Pakistan army took so long to come to the embassy's rescue. In subsequent coups, troops were able to move between their quarters in Rawalpindi to the general area where the US embassy was located in less than 35 minutes. Some American officials felt that the Pakistanis wanted the Americans to sweat a bit, whereas others believed that Pakistani intelligence instigated demonstrations in several cities, but the one in Islamabad got out of hand. Zia privately cited the incident as evidence of why the United States needed a military strongman like him to control an emotional and volatile Pakistani nation. Only a dictator like him could channel the religious fervor of Pakistanis against the Soviets, instead of allowing it to run against the United States, he averred. In the context of developments in Iran, this argument found some favor among Americans. Eventually, Zia agreed that Pakistan would compensate the United States for its totally gutted embassy building. But he was already working on ensuring that Pakistan received enough American assistance to cover much more than the building's cost. Almost a month after the attack on the US Embassy in Islamabad, Soviet troops marched into Afghanistan in support of the country's embattled communist government. The Soviet intervention was a response to the complex infighting between Afghan communist factions. With access to Soviet archives, several scholars have concluded that there was no grand design in the Soviet military's move. Opinion in Washington had so far been divided between those who saw the Afghan communist regime as a Soviet cat's paw and those who considered developments in Afghanistan independent of superpower rivalry. The direct induction of Soviet troops settled that argument. The Soviets had been sucked into their Vietnam quagmire. The Carter administration was already looking weak to Americans as a result of the Iranian hostage crisis, in which revolutionary students had taken 52 Americans from the US Embassy in Iran. The crisis was ongoing when Soviet tanks crossed into Afghanistan. So Carter could not afford to respond weakly to this new challenge. For the American public, both events symbolized a decline in US power. There was little Carter could do at this stage about the hostages, but he could certainly flex some muscle over Afghanistan to project strong leadership. In February 1979, Carter had played down the importance of Afghanistan during a speech at the Foreign Policy Conference for Editors and Broadcasters. He had said that the regime in Afghanistan, a nation under Soviet influence, was replaced by a regime more closely aligned with the Soviet Union. But after the Soviet invasion, he said that Afghanistan was a sovereign nation, a non-aligned nation, a deeply religious nation, and the Soviets invaded it, brutally. Carter described the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the installation of a puppet government as a serious threat to peace. The day after the Soviet troops marched into Afghanistan, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a memo to Carter in which he said that although Afghanistan could become a Soviet Vietnam, it posed a grave challenge for the United States in the short term. The Carter administration, he feared, would come under pressure to be as decisive militarily in Iran as the Soviets had been in Afghanistan. But the United States had to be careful to avoid direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. Brzezinski argued that Iran and Afghanistan were now both in turmoil, while Pakistan was both unstable internally and extremely apprehensive externally. Soviet success in Afghanistan, he argued, could produce Soviet presence right down on the edge of the Arabian and Oman Gulfs. In his analysis, it was essential that the Afghan resistance continued. This means more money as well as arms shipments to the rebels and some technical advice, he wrote. Consequently, the National Security Advisor proposed a review of US policy toward Pakistan to include more guarantees and more aid. He stated that the United States should encourage the Chinese to help the rebels also, and should concert with Islamic countries both in a propaganda campaign and in a covert action campaign to help the rebels. In Brzezinski's view, the Afghan guerrillas were badly organized and poorly led. They had limited foreign support and no sanctuary, no organized army, and no central government, all of which North Vietnam had. Instead of being sanguine about Afghanistan becoming a Soviet Vietnam, the United States would have to create circumstances for that to happen. The Soviets are likely to act decisively, he warned, adding that in world politics, nothing succeeds like success, whatever the moral aspects. Carter initiated discussion within his administration over the appropriate American response to the new Afghan situation. At a meeting of the National Security Council, chaired by Carter, the question of the Soviet invasion's impact on Pakistan came up. CIA Deputy Director Frank Carlucci, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown, and Brzezinski agreed that the United States needed to bolster Pakistan through greater economic and military assistance. White House counsel Lloyd Cutler reminded everyone present of the legal problem of providing aid to Pakistan. Secretary of State Vance explained that the Symington Amendment precluded the US government from providing military credits to Pakistan. After reading the law from his brief, he concluded that money could not be provided to Pakistan under the Foreign Assistance Act as long as Pakistan persisted with its nuclear program. Carter said he thought Zia had given an assurance that he would not test nuclear weapons, but that he could not bind his successor. Vance replied that the Pakistanis had pulled back from that commitment. Zia was now saying only that they would not test a nuclear weapon in the next 6 months. That was inadequate to provide the US president room to waive the restrictions under the Symington Amendment. Vance pointed out that the United States could try to change the provisions of the Symington Amendment, but if we take this approach, we also confront the whole non-proliferation issue head-on. Another way, in his view, would be to have a special provision that simply said that, notwithstanding any other provision of law, the United States would go ahead with assistance to Pakistan. Brzezinski suggested that if the administration offered one-time emergency support to Pakistan, Congress might support the idea of the notwithstanding any other provision of law approach. While the Americans worried about a Soviet military presence in Afghanistan threatening Pakistan, Zia looked upon it as an opportunity. 50,000 Soviet troops were now in a country that shared a long mountainous border with his own. If Pakistan was able to elicit so much interest from the United States based on its relative proximity to the Soviet Union, it could do much better now. Zia somberly spoke to a string of American visitors, including journalists, of the danger the Red Army's presence next door posed. But he did not move any troops from Pakistan's border with India to its border with Afghanistan. No one asked him why the Pakistan army was not immediately reconfigured. Without moving the troops, Zia could not confront the Soviets, whom he accused of planning to cross the Khyber Pass and reach the Arabian Sea through Pakistan. There would have to be at least some Pakistani resistance before American and other Western troops came to Pakistan's defense. For Zia, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan brought an international recognition that had eluded him since his ascent to power. The Americans initiated discussions about augmenting Pakistan's defenses with several countries. Brzezinski and Christopher traveled to Saudi Arabia and got the kingdom's concurrence for a unique arrangement. The Saudis would match dollar for dollar anything the United States spent on arming the Mujahideen. They would also provide cash for military equipment that could be provided to Pakistan only on the basis of cash sales. In return, Pakistan would provide military input to Saudi security. Defense Secretary Brown told China's Vice Premier Geng Biao in Beijing that the United States planned to resume economic and military assistance to Pakistan despite the nuclear problem. The United States will continue to object to the nuclear program, Brown said, but we will now set that aside for the time being and concentrate on strengthening Pakistan against potential Soviet action. Given Pakistan's close ties with China, Brown's message was bound to reach Islamabad even before the Defense Secretary had returned to base. The US policy that emerged immediately after Soviet troops moved into Afghanistan revolved around Pakistan. As Vance wrote in his memoir, Carter was willing to seek congressional approval to waive the legal prohibition on military aid to Pakistan. At the same time, the United States would reaffirm its nuclear non-proliferation policy and press Pakistan to provide acceptable guarantees that it would not develop a nuclear weapon. But the first step was to reach agreement with Pakistan on the terms of an assistance package. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan had flipped. The New York Times headline, "Pakistan is no longer the ardent suitor, but the prize to be courted," captured it exactly. Zia handled the new situation with panache. He was eager to partner with the United States, but he made it seem like a difficult decision. He emphasized Pakistan's strategic position and its being the back door to the Gulf, and praised the United States as the champions of the free world. But he also spoke of the vulnerability of Pakistan to Soviet and Indian pressures. Zia wanted to bargain for the maximum support from the United States while accepting the minimum of conditions. He told a group of newspaper editors that he was reluctant to accept US arms because we've had bitter experiences with US aid in the past. He said he wanted to know from Washington just what kind of military aid it was considering sending to Pakistan and on what terms. Zia has told associates that a limited amount of US aid is meaningless, reported the Washington Post. Pakistan's wish list for military equipment included advanced fighter bomber aircraft, artillery, communications equipment, and either more and better tanks or sophisticated anti-tank weapons to allow it to defend itself against a tank attack. On the list were planes that would not be fully supplied to the US Air Force until the mid-1980s. Pakistan, as before, could not afford to buy the sophisticated weapons it required. It wanted the United States to either give it the weapons or to arrange for favorable credit terms. Pakistan feels the US owes it this. These weapons were ostensibly being sought in view of the threat posed by the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. But items such as tanks could not conceivably be used along Pakistan's mountainous border with Afghanistan. They were clearly intended for the plains of the Punjab and Sindh, along the border with India. In fact, Pakistan had been asking for American tanks since it lost many in the 1965 war, long before any Soviet soldier had crossed into Afghanistan. No sooner had Zia asked for US weapons than Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi voiced her fears that these might eventually be used against India. Zia was finally getting his wish of US involvement in the jihad Pakistan had initiated in Afghanistan. Pakistan's interest in the project had been to force Afghanistan into settling its claims on Pakistan's Pashtun territories. But now that the Soviet military move had shocked the Americans into paying attention, Zia played hard to get. He was aware that at least some people in the US government would not mind paying a higher price for Pakistan's cooperation in bleeding the Soviets. The Pakistani dictator added assurances against a possible threat of attack from India to the list of his demands from the United States before accepting aid against the Soviets. Brzezinski publicly reassured Pakistan that the United States stands behind them and reiterated the terms of the 1959 US-Pakistan Mutual Defense Treaty, which committed the United States to come to Pakistan's aid in case of communist attack. Brzezinski wrote later that the Pakistanis were rather concerned that they might be the next target of Soviet military aggression. But he still stated plainly that the United States could not guarantee support in the event of an Indian attack. Zia realized that the Americans were interested primarily in the covert war that would bleed the Soviets. He bargained hard for favors for Pakistan without shutting off the clandestine program of assistance to the Mujahideen. This won him the support of anti-communist hardliners in the United States. The covert program expanded dramatically to include new weapons and advanced training for the Mujahideen. Thus, the insurgents were totally dependent on Pakistan. Arms deliveries had stepped up as a result of funding from Saudi Arabia and the CIA. Zia wanted to convince the United States of the value of supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, while he also wanted to send the message that the hopes of creating a Vietnam-like quagmire would remain unfulfilled without meeting Pakistan's demands. Zia then went on an offensive in the US media. He said he would not risk the wrath of the Soviet Union without a good treaty of friendship and, in conjunction with others, economic and military assurance, in that order of priority. He also rejected as peanuts the offer of a $400 million two-year economic and military aid package that the Carter administration was cobbling together. If this is true, he said, it is terribly disappointing. Pakistan will not buy its security with $400 million. It will buy greater animosity from the Soviet Union, which is now more influential in this region than the US. Shahi, the Pakistan foreign minister, separately said that Pakistan expected several $billion in US military aid to build up its defense along its western border with Afghanistan. Playing the bad cop, Shahi also said, "We are sick of depending on the political whims of the US and US public opinion, which from time to time puts Pakistan in the doghouse." The Pakistani message was designed for maximum effect in Washington. "All that we are trying to do is enable us to stand on our own feet and fight for ourselves," Zia said, appealing to the American respect for self-sufficiency. He claimed that he was only seeking moral help, a sort of hand on my back, so that I can really put my chest out and say, "No, I am not alone. We have friends in this world." In response, skeptics pointed out that Pakistan had received significant amounts of US aid in the past. Zia replied that it had not been enough, otherwise we wouldn't have been in bad economic trouble. He reflected Pakistan's overall attitude toward US assistance, that it was somehow owed to Pakistan. When a reporter reminded him that economic aid since 1948 totaled $5 billion, Zia looked surprised. "Unfortunately, it hasn't been effective, partially due to our own fault. Our own economic policies haven't been that effective," he said. Zia insisted that Pakistan was the only country where the West still had influence, in a broad crescent stretching right from Turkey down to Vietnam. If the United States wanted to help Pakistan, it needed to give an assurance about Pakistan's security and integrity, he told ABC News. If any country like the Soviet Union attacks Pakistan, it will be war with the free world or with the United States and the United Kingdom. Zia argued that if the United States could give security guarantees to South Korea, Israel, Taiwan and Egypt, why could it not provide one for Pakistan? Few Americans, including many considered experts on South Asia, remembered that Liaquat had sought a similar guarantee in 1950, when there were no Soviet troops in Afghanistan. Little had changed in Pakistan's security thinking in 30 years. The Pakistanis had either not understood or did not want to understand the reasons for US unwillingness to go to war for Pakistan, especially against its principal foe, India. The Americans were willing to ignore the fact that Pakistan's primary security concern was still a country with which the United States had no major conflict. It was only a matter of time before Pakistan's usefulness against the Soviets would subside, and the old argument about the United States deserting Pakistan in dealing with India would resurface. Zia's message was targeted at those Americans who did not bother with details about other countries' history or with their long-term strategic thinking. In one interview, Zia insisted that connivance of the Soviet Union and India in 1971 had bifurcated Pakistan, glossing over Pakistan's domestic circumstances that led to Bangladesh's secession. He also insisted that he could prove that there is a great conspiracy against Pakistan to strangulate Pakistan. Zia also voiced the belief that Israel and their friend India were involved in an organized conspiracy against Pakistan at a time when India and Israel did not even have full diplomatic relations. But US policymakers did not pay attention to these manifestations of a conspiracy theory mindset. There were a few voices, some echoed in the columns of major American newspapers, that warned that close military ties with Pakistan would lead to entanglements that the United States could do without. But within the administration, there was consensus that fueling jihad in Afghanistan could be useful for US interests, and for that reason, Pakistan had to be armed and funded. From Zia's perspective, getting American support was just the first step. The next was getting enough support. He was looking for a latter-day Dulles, not the cautious officials of a reluctant superpower, which was how he saw Carter's administration. Americans knew a little more about Pakistan now than they did in the era of Dulles. But Pakistan also had more friends in the United States than it did earlier, Zia thought. The head of Saudi intelligence, Prince Turki bin Faisal al Saud, was also guiding the Pakistani military regime in handling the Americans. Zia wanted to negotiate a deal that would get American backing not only for the immediate needs for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, but also for Pakistan's longer-term requirements. Bombarded with the pros and cons of aiding Zia and Pakistan, the US media reflected the debates among American policymakers. The Washington Post said that the United States had to accept Zia for what he was, the man running Pakistan now. It supported giving Zia's regime the kind and amount of help that will make plain that the US understands its larger stake in the security of Pakistan, and then, eyes open, to try to limit the collateral damage. Conversely, the New York Times reminded the administration that the understandable desire to discourage further Soviet advance in Asia should not be at the expense of non-proliferation goals. Preventing the spread of nuclear arms in Asia is no less important to world security than containing the Soviet Union, the paper said in an editorial. Pakistan should not be misled about the depth of the American commitment to non-proliferation, it insisted. The Times also questioned the wisdom of seeking India's tolerance for aid to Pakistan by way of opening shipments of nuclear fuel for its American-built reactor. Meanwhile, India said that the induction of arms into Pakistan would convert South Asia into a theatre of great power confrontation and conflict. The Indian government felt that once Pakistan again started receiving sophisticated US weapons, it would de-accelerate the process of normalization with India. Zia made no effort to address India's concerns. Instead, he repeated the Pakistani mantra. Pakistan wanted equality to be the determining factor in India-Pakistan relations. For Indians, this was code for an aggressive posture toward them, as it had been in the past. They protested vehemently that the United States was about to make a mistake. Pakistan's military preparedness, the Indians argued, would only exacerbate Pakistani jingoism against India. Carter sent former Defense Secretary Clark Clifford to India in an effort to placate Indian leaders. As an elder statesman who had also advised Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson, Clifford was much admired in India. In Delhi, he offered India cutting-edge military equipment to offset the impact of US supplies to Pakistan. But the wisdom of this attempt to win over both Pakistan and India with inducements comprising military hardware was questionable. All it did was reinforce Pakistan's belief that it could militarily beat India with the right weapons, as it also offered India some equipment to match the weapons provided to Pakistan. It is hard to watch Zbigniew Brzezinski and Clark Clifford tracking over South Asia, observed the Washington Post, the one sewing up the details of a substantial military and economic package to Pakistan, the other offering a new arms package including sophisticated guidance systems and smart bombs to India, without feeling a little warning buzz of unease. This article thus voiced fears that the United States would be repeating the mistake of military supplies policy that led to both Pakistan and India using American weapons in their earlier wars. The problem for the United States was that it wanted to get involved in Afghanistan, but there was no way of bypassing Pakistan to do so. In a brief for members of Congress, the Congressional Research Service summarized the American dilemma. US options for influencing events in Afghanistan, it said, are limited to providing direct or indirect assistance to the Afghan guerrilla forces and refugees, and to support the regime of President Zia-ul-Haq in neighboring Pakistan. In both cases, the options required working through the Pakistani government, since that country is the only haven of the Afghan insurgents to which the US has access. The Carter administration also tried hard to balance concerns over non-proliferation with the opening for calibrated confrontation that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan presented. The administration plans to seek urgent congressional approval for a substantial amount of economic and security assistance to Pakistan over the next 18 months, the State Department informed American embassies in several European capitals. But it emphasized that US global non-proliferation policy remained unchanged. The Symington and Glenn amendments would remain in place, and the United States would continue to press the Pakistanis on the issue of nuclear proliferation. But instead of coercive measures, the United States would focus on persuasion. The United States thought that it was in Pakistan's own best interest to abandon its nuclear enrichment and processing programs and other sensitive nuclear activities. If someone in the US government had a blueprint of how they would convince Pakistanis to give up on what they considered their national interest, they did not put it in writing. Brzezinski led an American team to Pakistan to persuade Zia that he should accept the US offer, which would increase once Carter had won re-election in November 1980. The New York Times quipped that Brzezinski told Zia that $400 million in aid was hardly peanuts, and that a certain Georgia farmer would always know how to raise more. However, the White House had not yet considered where China came in and had ignored the possibility of a fourth war between India and Pakistan. With or without a Soviet involvement, would Americans have to defend Pakistan? What if Pakistani bungling and Soviet meddling stir rebellion in Baluchistan, near the Persian Gulf? The New York Times queried. Can General Zia hold the loyalty of his peoples? Could Americans help him? Should they? Pronouncements about arming Afghan insurgents and building Pakistan's military reflected a mood, the Times editorial declared. But until these questions were answered, it was not yet a policy. Zia announced at a press conference that the US offer of aid was inadequate, and Pakistan would not be able to accept it unless its quantum was increased significantly. In separate editorials, The Washington Post and the New York Times both suggested that Pakistan's refusal of the American offer of aid might have been a good thing. The Post argued that Pakistan was not the place where the United States should draw a line against further Soviet adventures. In its view, the Zia regime would have taken fresh American arms and used them first against the very non-Punjabi minorities that it needs to conciliate in order to strengthen and legitimize its rule. The paper hoped that Zia's rejection of the quantum of aid would prevent unwise and irreversible policy choices being made. The Times pointed out that $400 million could not be described as peanuts. Pakistan, it said, was using the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to advance more grandiose ambitions. The country was seeking instant, massive, and unconditional military help on a scale that would have served no American interest. In the paper's opinion, no amount of American military assistance, remember Iran, could really have secured the Zia regime from the internal insurgencies of disaffected ethnic minorities. The Carter administration and the US media were both unaware that Zia had turned down the aid package based on a careful forecast of the American election's outcome. Carter was facing a primary challenge from Senator Edward Kennedy. The US economy was torpid, and the hostage crisis in Iran was dragging on, with no end in sight. Carter would probably not win re-election. Zia's friends in Saudi Arabia, as well as in the United States, advised him that the likely Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan, would be more likely to support Pakistan's plans in Afghanistan than would the embattled Carter administration. Historically, Pakistan had never turned down American aid, even when it was meager compared with the country's request. The Pakistani pattern had been to accept what was offered while continuing to ask for more. Zia was now treading new ground. In the hope of a better deal down the line, Pakistani officials told reporters that they were waiting to find out what Saudi Arabia would offer them before accepting the US offer. The Pakistanis had in mind a military and economic package from Washington of $2 billion annually over a 5-year period, a total amount of $10 billion. Amidst the haggling over the size of an aid package for Pakistan, the CIA director received warning that the Pakistanis were interpreting US willingness to resume aid as acceptance of their nuclear program. The CIA's Nuclear Proliferation Intelligence Section observed that the Pakistani resolve to move ahead with its nuclear program had been reinforced. By the time the US presidential primaries concluded, Zia had made up his mind. He would wait until after the US elections before concluding an aid deal with the United States. The likelihood of Ronald Reagan becoming president appeared much greater, so instead of negotiating with a lame duck administration, Zia would spend the rest of the year approaching conservative anti-communists in the United States. Zia's plan was to portray the Afghan Mujahideen as a primitive, tribal David, challenging the Soviet Goliath in a remote part of Central Asia. By the time the new American president was in office, he reasoned, there would be sufficient momentum for the idea of supporting a holy war in Afghanistan. In addition to inviting almost every American and British journalist known for his anti-communist credentials, Zia also reached out to retired military officers, businessmen and socialites with political connections. Among the people Zia invited to visit Pakistan and meet the Mujahideen was Texas socialite Joanne Herring, whose second husband, Robert Herring, was chairman of the Houston National Gas, HNG, company. HNG, which later emerged as Enron, had business interests in the greater Middle East, and Robert was offered the position of Pakistan's honorary consul in Houston. He, in turn, proposed that Joanne simultaneously hold the title of honorary consul for Morocco and Pakistan. The Herrings were politically well connected, though Joanne was known more for glamour than for political wisdom. In her memoir, written years later, she spoke of Pakistan as an Arab nation, demonstrating that she knew little about the country she represented as honorary consul. But she was devoutly anti-communist and knew many influential people who shared her beliefs. Zia knew that, and so he showered her with hospitality in order to use her connections. Zia wanted the Afghan Mujahideen to become heroes to American anti-communists. On his suggestion, Joanne brought along her photographer's son, Robin King, and adventurer and movie maker Charles Fawcett to Pakistan. Their joint effort, facilitated by Pakistan's Information Ministry and Army Public Relations, resulted in a documentary film about the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the brave men resisting it. Herring showed the film Courage is Our Weapon at parties and in salons upon her return to the United States. Those who viewed it included donors to conservative causes, Republican public officials, and several individuals who could be expected to hold senior appointed positions in a Republican administration. By the time of the US presidential election in November 1980, Zia had succeeded in creating the image of the Mujahideen as simple, honorable peasant soldiers resisting communist occupation of their homeland. The obscurantism of Afghan resistance leaders remained well hidden, as did the regional political motives of their Pakistani sponsors. For example, long before the Soviet invasion, Mujahideen leader Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was known in Kabul for throwing acid on women who did not cover their faces. Now Americans such as Herring viewed him with the romance that Western leftists once felt for Ho Chi Minh or Che Guevara. With Ronald Reagan's inauguration as the 40th President of the United States, Zia came close to fulfilling his desire to secure Pakistan's interest in Afghanistan with American help. The new administration was eager to implement Brzezinski's advice that the United States would have to take several actions to convert Afghanistan into a quagmire for the Soviets, similar to the one the Americans were sucked into in Vietnam. From the outset, explained Robert Gates, who was then the CIA's deputy director, the Reagan administration targeted covert action, foreign assistance, diplomacy, and even direct military intervention on Third World battlegrounds in opposition to the Soviets, Cubans, Libyans, and anyone else perceived to be a surrogate of the Soviet Union. Afghanistan was a particularly attractive battleground because the Soviets, and not their surrogates, were directly in the battlefield. Understanding the US objective, Zia realized his position of strength in bargaining with the Americans. Some US assistance was already trickling in for the Mujahideen, but Zia said that Pakistan was not ready to serve as a conduit for the supply of arms to the Afghan freedom fighters. In doing so, he wanted to make sure that the terms of engagement, as well as full operational control of the jihad, stayed in Pakistan's hands. Some Americans outside the administration could see what he was doing. Zia, said a Washington Post editorial, was plainly ready to trade on the country's strategic utility for the United States so as to acquire the aid and arms necessary to protect his country and to keep himself in power. It advised caution in broadening American commitment to a regime that is at once uncertain and necessarily fixed on its own agenda. But the new US Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, dismissed these concerns. He underscored the Reagan administration's determination to stop Soviet expansionism and told a Pakistani delegation of the administration's commitment to being supportive of Pakistan. In Hague, the Pakistanis had found their new dollars. In a message to all US embassies titled US Policy Towards Pakistan, Haig declared that Pakistan's security is inextricably linked to our own security and to that of industrialized democracies, primarily because of Western and Japanese dependence on Persian Gulf oil. The United States, he said, had concluded that a stronger, more self-confident Pakistan was essential for the enhanced deterrence to Soviet expansionism which we seek. Like Dulles, Haig also expressed admiration for Pakistan's large, well-trained armed forces and its good Islamic credentials. He also reasoned subsequently that Pakistan's sense of insecurity motivated its quest for nuclear weapons. If the United States helped Pakistan feel secure, there would be no reason for Pakistan to continue seeking a nuclear deterrent, he argued. The new administration also changed the US objective from stopping Pakistan's nuclear program altogether to building a closer security relationship, which would make the Pakistans develop the sense of being more secure. Such a relationship would provide Pakistan with incentives to forego, or at least delay, a nuclear test, and would work better than alternative approaches, argued a new CIA paper on non-proliferation. But Zia repeatedly made it clear that making Pakistan feel secure, especially in relation to India, was not going to be easy. The Pakistani dictator continued his media offensive even after the contours of an aid program had been agreed on by the spring of 1981. He told Newsweek that India had been building its military strength not for China or any smaller neighbor, but Pakistan. The Jaguar aircraft and tanks from the Soviet Union, he said, could not be used against China because of the mountainous terrain. According to Zia, Pakistan could not pose a threat to India, so the only plausible reason for its military build-up had to be its desire for Pakistan to remain a weak state that accepts Indian hegemony. He told the BBC that Pakistan wanted Indians to realize that they must accept the existence of Pakistan, that they must reconcile themselves to Pakistan being a reality. In June, the State Department announced that the United States and Pakistan had agreed on a $3.2 billion military and economic aid program to strengthen Pakistani defenses against a serious threat from Soviet troops in Afghanistan. The statement made no reference to the nuclear weapons issue. Included in the package were advanced F-16 fighter jets that Pakistan had sought for many years. Zia saw this as a major success. He would now receive US money to maintain domestic government spending as well as to equip his military. American assistance would consolidate his dictatorship, just as it had enabled Ayub to rule for a decade. The military would get much-needed equipment, and Pakistani Islamists could be trained alongside the Afghans to become a secondary militia for both regional and domestic purposes. Pakistanis also assumed that they could continue their nuclear program as long as they did not conduct a nuclear test. In an effort to ensure that the US commitment remained long-term, Zia also revived the idea of US bases in Pakistan that had earlier been mooted by Ayub in the 1950s and by Bhutto immediately after the Pakistani defeat in the 1971 war with India. Zia raised the matter with State Department Counsellor Robert Budd McFarlane during a meeting in Islamabad. "Why don't you ask us to grant bases?" asked Zia. McFarlane was unprepared for the question. He responded that it would be inconceivable for the United States to seek military bases in Pakistan. But the offer reinforced Pakistan's willingness to be a close American ally. The US Congress, however, challenged the Reagan administration's new Pakistan policy. Hearings on Capitol Hill focused on the nuclear issue, forcing the administration to cite Pakistan's absolute assurances that it was neither developing nor planning to develop nuclear weapons. Under Secretary of State James Buckley, who had visited Islamabad to conclude the aid agreement, told the Senate Government Affairs Subcommittee, "I was assured by the ministers and by the President himself that it was not the intention of the Pakistan government to develop nuclear weapons." He insisted on the distinction between the nuclear option and a nuclear weapon. Although there was widespread support in Washington for the Afghan Mujahideen and the idea of undermining the Soviet Union, aid to Pakistan remained unpopular. The Washington Post advised against visibly embracing Zia, whose position it deemed unpredictable. Pakistan should only be given arms that show clearly which Pakistani purpose the US supports, not competition with India, but defense of its Afghan border against Soviet incursions. The New York Times demanded that legal restrictions be imposed that force Pakistan to choose between usable weapons and a costly nuclear badge. One of the most prescient warnings appeared in a letter to the editor in the Times by Jeremiah Novak, a former corporate executive who wrote occasional columns about Asian affairs, captioned, "How Pakistan Can Get US Jets and Build the Islamic Bomb." It pointed out that the Reagan administration's willingness to believe Pakistani assurances on the nuclear issue had failed to analyze the divergence between US and Pakistani goals. Novak highlighted reports about Saudi Arabia providing Pakistan with nearly $2 billion of aid, an additional economic package in return for the stationing of Pakistani troops in Saudi Arabia, and the money for Pakistan's purchase of American F-16s. This second package is linked to the Islamic bomb Pakistan is alleged to be building, Novak wrote, adding that the bomb may be ready for a test explosion in October 1982, when the Saudi-financed F-16s are to be delivered. He argued that an American withdrawal of aid would be too late to stop Pakistan from going nuclear. He cited Shahi's statements about the Israeli menace and his support for the Islamic Revolution of Iran, so as to suggest that Pakistan expected broad backing of the Islamic countries in its nuclear endeavors. According to Novak, Shahi had said that the United States had to defend Pakistan because of its confrontation with the Soviet Union, not for altruistic reasons, but because the whole balance of power in the Gulf region will come under danger. Assisting Pakistan while compromising on US policy goals, he argued, could give the Arabs access to the bomb, entangle Pakistan in Middle East politics, and endanger India. The Reagan White House, however, most likely paid no attention to a letter in a newspaper, as it was also ignoring more official correspondence on the same issue. Around the same time, the US Embassy in London informed Washington that West German national Heinz Mebus may attempt to circumvent French export control regulations concerning calcium metal. According to the embassy's report, Mebus had previously supplied a large amount of equipment to Pakistan's uranium enrichment program. His attempts to buy calcium metal would advance Pakistan's nuclear program. The State Department understood that Pakistan was procuring the calcium metal not for use in an energy program, but instead for use in a nuclear explosive device. But for the Reagan administration, fighting the Soviet Union through proxies in Afghanistan was more important. Soon after taking office, Reagan had appointed his presidential election campaign manager, William Casey, as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Casey enjoyed the president's confidence and was the first CIA head to attend meetings as a fully participating cabinet member. According to Gates, Bill Casey came to the CIA primarily to wage war against the Soviet Union. He faced the task of building up the CIA's capability for military and political action outside the United States, at a time when the agency was recovering from criticism of its past illegal and inappropriate activities. Casey hoped to enhance support for anti-communist insurgent organizations around the world. Under his leadership, the CIA helped more than 250,000 people take up arms against communism. The CIA extended support to rebels in Nicaragua, Angola, Cambodia, and Ethiopia, as well as Afghanistan. But in all of these theaters of war, CIA personnel were directly involved in the planning, training, and conduct of operations. For Afghanistan, however, Zia offered a different model. Pakistan's ISI would run the show for the CIA as long as it received funding and weapons. Since June 1979, the ISI was headed by General Akhtar Abdul Rahman, an infantry officer loyal to Zia who shared his ideological vision based on Islamic nationalism. As a junior officer, Rahman had aided the tribal militias raised in 1947 to fight in Kashmir. Thus, he was not new to managing religiously motivated, irregular fighters. Soon after taking command of the ISI, he crafted a detailed plan for expanding the insurgency in Afghanistan. Once Casey became chief of the CIA, Rahman built a close relationship with him and other CIA officials. Pakistan's interest was not only to help the Americans drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan, but also to ensure that the next government in Kabul was totally beholden to Pakistan. Strengthening Afghan Islamists would create a counterweight to Pashtun nationalism. Pakistan could always divert covert funds from the Afghan insurgency toward fomenting insurgency against the source of its perceived principal threat, India. Support from all over the Muslim world was expected to fulfill Pakistan's pan-Islamist aspirations. Zia also hoped to rally Pakistanis around the banner of Islam and jihad. There was some concern that the Soviets might use India to wage direct war against Pakistan in case the war in Afghanistan became unbearable for Moscow. For that reason, Zia told Casey that the US-Pakistan objective in Afghanistan should be to keep the pot boiling, but not boil over. Casey did not see any problem with the more local aspects of Zia's ambitions. For him, Afghanistan was just one battlefield in a global war. Letting the ISI take the lead role saved Casey the headache of operational details of a covert war, as it also protected him from blame if anything went wrong. The ISI recruited and trained mujahideen from among the 3 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan. Peshawar and Quetta became the major centers for the Afghan jihad. Although many secular and liberal Afghans also joined the fight against Soviet occupation, the ISI showed preference for radical Islamist factions. The CIA provided money and arms and was content with taking credit in the United States for the successes of the Afghan freedom fighters. From 1981 to 1983, the CIA's covert program was funded at the same level as Carter proposed, around $60 million a year from the United States, with a matching amount from Saudi Arabia. But beginning in 1984, funding levels increased dramatically. A colorful Texan congressman, Charlie Wilson, adopted the cause of the Afghan Mujahideen, partly under the influence of Joanne Herring, the Texas socialite. Wilson was the senior Democrat on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. He pushed a $40 million increase in funding through Congress just as Casey persuaded the Saudis to raise their contribution to $75 million for 1984 and to $100 million in 1985. Increased Saudi commitment required the United States to increase its contribution because of the matching funds agreement already in place. There was another big increase in the fall of 1984. On October the 11th, 1984, Casey proposed to the Saudis that each country provide $250 million for the next year to handle larger Soviet offensives expected in the spring and to bring increasing pressure on the Soviets. This was a huge jump. 2 weeks later, Casey sent word to the Pakistanis and the Saudis that the United States was planning to spend $250 million in 1985. By the end of the year, Wilson was urging that the US commitment go up to $300 million. These vast amounts were almost entirely funneled through the ISI, which by the mid-1980s had become several times larger than its original size. Not surprisingly then, the ISI really liked Casey. Brigadier Mohammed Yousaf, who ran the Afghan operation, appreciated the autonomy Casey allowed his agency. Whatever his personal motivations, he wrote of Casey, the result for us was always positive. He would often turn to his staff, who were perhaps disputing some request of ours, with the words, "No, the General knows what he wants," a reference to ISI's General Rahman. According to Yousaf, the CIA supported the Mujahideen by buying arms, ammunition, and equipment. It was their secret arms procurement branch that was kept busy, he wrote. But a cardinal rule of Pakistan's policy barred the Americans from being involved with the distribution of funds or arms once they arrived in the country. No Americans ever trained or had direct contact with the Mujahideen, and no American official ever went inside Afghanistan. The Pakistanis justified operational control not by acknowledging their separate agenda, but by claiming that the CIA was not competent to deal with the ground realities of Afghanistan. I stress that the CIA's strength was in their access to sophisticated technology, explained Yousaf. If it was possible to solve a problem by technical means, they would get the answer. But if military decisions had to be made on the basis of experience, military knowledge, or even applied military common sense, then in my view, few CIA officers could come up with workable solutions, he observed. The CIA and other American supporters of the Pakistan-based insurgency focused solely on Soviet losses. The Red Army lost more men and equipment than they had in any military engagement since World War II. Once the Mujahideen had been provided shoulder-borne Stinger surface-to-air missiles, the Soviet ability to keep the insurgents at bay diminished further. Meanwhile, Pakistan took advantage of its operational autonomy to pursue its own agenda. Barely a year after the United States resumed large-scale aid to Pakistan and got deeply involved in the Afghan war, the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research noted concern about Pakistan's nuclear program. The Pakistanis, it said, have not slowed their efforts to get the bomb, and it reported that there was new evidence of significant People's Republic of China assistance on at least the weapons design side. This intelligence resulted in the 2 visits to Pakistan from US presidential envoy Vernon Walters, during which Zia assured him of being honorable and promising not to build a nuclear weapon. George Shultz, who had replaced Haig as Secretary of State, pressed Reagan to raise the matter with Zia during his state visit in December 1982. But the US president was still content to accept Zia's word of honor and continued to maintain close relations with him because of Pakistan's centrality to the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. The nuclear program was not Pakistan's only clandestine activity to which the United States chose to turn a blind eye. Washington also ignored Indian accusation about Pakistan's role in fomenting rebellion among Sikhs in India's Punjab state. Soon after the beginning of America's augmented assistance program to Pakistan, a group of religious Sikhs started demanding a separate homeland, to be called Khalistan. Graffiti appeared in Delhi with the message, "The Sikhs are a nation." India asserted that Pakistan's ISI was funding the Khalistan campaign. US media reports cited Sikh separatists speaking of establishing close ties with the Jamaat-e-Islami, a Pakistani fundamentalist organization active in supporting the Afghan Mujahideen. A branch of the Jamaat was also active in Kashmir. "One day the people of Kashmir will turn to Pakistan and we will benefit," Sikh activist Gajendra Singh was quoted as saying. "One thing is certain. The next war with Pakistan will result in a Pakistani Kashmir and a sovereign Khalistan." The Sikh insurgents resorted to terrorist tactics, resulting in harsh measures from the Indian government. An official Indian report spoke of the encouragement, connivance and assistance of certain foreign powers in the plans to create an independent Sikh state. In time, the militant movement would have developed into a full-scale insurgency which would have crippled the armed forces in any future confrontation across the borders, the report said. The border referred to was obviously Pakistan, the only country that shares the Punjab border with India. India asserted that the Sikh militants were well-trained and well-disciplined militarily. Their training was allegedly carried out in what were ostensibly religious camps in the Pakistani-controlled portion of Kashmir, in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and in Sikh temples across India. The report quoted a number of Sikh exiles as having said that Pakistan was a natural ally and that it had promised aid. But Pakistan denied involvement, although Zia said that gunrunners could have smuggled arms into Punjab without the government's knowledge. The United States decided to ignore allegations of Pakistani involvement in the Sikh uprising. When Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was killed in October 1984 by an enraged Sikh bodyguard, Washington tried to calm the ensuing India-Pakistan tensions without publicly acknowledging Pakistan's ties to Sikh militants. The Khalistan militancy would end years later, only after India initiated retaliatory terrorist strikes in Pakistani Punjab. By then, 20,000 people had been killed in India, along with dozens in Pakistan. The collateral damage of the war to bleed the Soviets had spread out of Afghanistan. A Pakistan-backed insurgency in Kashmir was soon to follow. Another casualty of the focus on Afghanistan was the human rights situation inside Pakistan. Thousands of political prisoners languished in jail, and after anti-Zia demonstrations in Sindh in 1983, more than 100 people were sentenced to flogging in a single application of Islamic law. Dozens of demonstrators were killed. US Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger arrived in Pakistan amidst the riots, describing them an internal problem they seemed to be dealing with. Weinberger said Pakistan occupied a critical strategic position against the Soviet Union. They have a strong military, he declared, and we are trying to strengthen it all the more. Zia had modelled the now expanded ISI on the Soviet KGB, or the East German Stasi, which tried to control their citizens as part of their effort to maintain national security. The ISI had become the arbiter of Pakistani patriotism. The intelligence apparatus spied widely on Pakistani citizens, imprisoning those who disagreed with the government's policies. The media was fully controlled and was often used to build a specific national narrative. Benazir Bhutto, the daughter of the elected Prime Minister Zia had toppled and executed, became an internationally celebrated political prisoner before being forced into exile in London in January 1984. In 1985, the United States completed its disbursement of the $3.2 billion aid package for Pakistan. At this point, Pakistan and the administration were forced to address Congress's nuclear proliferation concerns before approving additional aid. Pakistani diplomats, as well as officials in the Reagan White House, supported an amendment to the Foreign Aid Bill that would help get around the restrictions of the Symington and Glenn amendments that forbade aid to countries with unsafeguarded nuclear programs. Named after Senator Larry Pressler, a Republican from South Dakota, the Pressler Amendment allowed aid to flow to Pakistan as long as the US president certified on an annual basis that Pakistan did not possess a nuclear explosive device. In a letter to Zia that praised his contribution to the war against the Soviets, Reagan warned of serious consequences if Pakistan enriched uranium beyond 5%. The hopes expressed by Haig that US-provided advanced conventional weapons would keep Pakistan from continuing with a nuclear program had, by now, proved futile. Within months of the Pressler Amendment's adoption, the US Defense Intelligence Agency reported that Pakistan had produced an atomic weapon in October 1985 with on-site technical assistance from China. The US intelligence community believed that Pakistan was producing enough highly enriched uranium for at least one atomic weapon. But still the administration committed itself to providing $4.02 billion in aid to Pakistan over the next 6 years, including additional F-16 aircraft. The White House presumed that Pakistan would hold uranium enrichment levels below 5% to continue qualifying for US assistance. This gave Pakistan the capability for going nuclear later, but enabled the US president to certify that Pakistan did not, as of yet, possess nuclear weapons. Each year from 1986 to 1988, Reagan signed the certificate required under the Pressler Amendment to keep the aid flowing. His successor, George H.W. Bush, did the same in 1989. By the end of Reagan's term, the CIA had spent $2 billion in aiding Afghan resistance fighters through Pakistan's ISI. The Saudis had officially matched the amount and had also provided additional support of an undisclosed amount. As the idea of an Islamic holy war became popular, volunteers from several Arab and Muslim countries flocked to Pakistan to fight alongside the Afghans. These warriors, most of whom constituted Al-Qaeda and its associated terrorist groups after the collapse of the Soviet Union, brought in extra funding from private Saudi contributors. At one point, some estimated that these private donations to the Afghan jihad contributed $25 million per month. The United States had succeeded in bleeding the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The United States had hoped to roll back what had been expanding Soviet influence in the Third World, and so Afghanistan, for the United States, was just the larger of a series of covert wars, the others being fought in Nicaragua, Cambodia, Ethiopia, and Angola, that were meant to punish the Soviet Union and inflict a heavy cost in men, money, and prestige. The CIA estimated that Soviet costs between 1981 and 1986 in Afghanistan, Angola and Nicaragua amounted to about $13 billion. Soviet casualties in Afghanistan included 13,310 dead and 35,478 wounded. By contrast, the United States lost no soldiers in its proxy engagements. By 1987 to 1988, the Americans had achieved their objective in Afghanistan. The Soviets, now led by the reformer Mikhail Gorbachev, were willing to negotiate a way out of their Afghan quagmire. But Pakistan's more expansive plans for permanent influence in Afghanistan and for extended jihad to Kashmir were still incomplete. Under US direction, Zia agreed to indirect talks in Geneva with the Soviet-installed Afghan government. But he dragged the talks so as to strengthen the hands of Mujahideen groups he wanted to see in control of Kabul later. Zia had organized controlled parliamentary elections in 1985 and appointed a civilian prime minister whom he expected to be weak and compliant. The new prime minister, Mohammad Khan Junejo, was a conservative provincial politician who slowly extended press freedom and demanded the removal of martial law. Although Zia kept Junejo from being briefed about Afghanistan for almost a year, the Prime Minister insisted on re-examining Zia's assumptions about the Afghan war. Like many Pakistani civilians, Junejo recognized that the country could not afford the burden of 3 million permanent Afghan refugees. The presence of a large number of trained militants on its soil undermined the writ of the Pakistani state. Further, arms intended for the Mujahideen had seeped into Pakistani cities and towns, producing a culture of violence. Drug trafficking had exponentially increased as areas bordering Afghanistan were allowed to descend into lawlessness. From Junejo's perspective, Pakistan needed an international agreement leading to a Soviet withdrawal and the repatriation of Afghan refugees and militants. Junejo also allowed Benazir Bhutto to return from exile to a rapturous welcome from millions of supporters. During her exile, she had made a favorable impression on Western journalists, diplomats, and some US congressmen. Although she was careful not to criticize the United States upon her return to Pakistan, Bhutto joined Junejo in questioning the wisdom of Pakistan's Afghan policy. Despite Zia's reservations and the ISI's objections, in April 1988, Pakistan and Afghanistan's communist government signed an agreement with the United States and the Soviet Union as guarantors. The Geneva Accord set a timetable for the complete withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan between May 15, 1988 and February 15, 1989. The Americans cheered what was clearly a Soviet defeat, but for Pakistan, war was far from over. The Pakistanis had given more than two-thirds of the resources the CIA provided to Islamist groups. As the Soviets began to withdraw, the ISI worked in tandem with these groups to exert control over Afghanistan. "We have earned the right to have in Kabul a power which is very friendly toward us," Zia told American scholar Selig Harrison. "We have taken risks as a frontline state, and we will not permit a return to the pre-war situation, marked by a large Indian and Soviet influence and Afghan claims on our own territory." Zia predicted that the new power will be really Islamic, a part of the Islamic Renaissance, which, you will see, will someday extend itself to the Soviet Muslims. But he did not live to lead Pakistan as it attempted to realize this dream. On August 17, 1988, he was killed in a mysterious plane crash along with General Rahman, the US ambassador to Pakistan, Arnold Rafael, and the chief of the US military mission to Pakistan, Brigadier General Herbert Wassam. Several other Pakistan Army generals and officers were also killed. Conspiracy theorists, later joined by one of Zia's daughters, accused the United States of eliminating Zia to preempt the Islamic Renaissance he had spoken about. Once again, the United States had supported a Pakistani military dictator by providing several $billion in economic aid and upgrading Pakistan's military hardware. American leaders had chosen to trust Zia's word against hard intelligence about Pakistan's nuclear program. However, not only had the United States failed to influence Pakistani policies, Even the followers of the dictator it supported were not willing to see America positively. Pakistan's state ideology and its perceived national interest were simply not congruent with those of the United States. But not all American officials had been blind to the divergence in US and Pakistani interests, especially toward the end of the anti-communist jihad in Afghanistan. After traveling through Afghanistan and Pakistan, Edmund McWilliams, a Foreign Service officer, had alerted the US government of the rising peril, noting that Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, backed by officers in ISI's Afghan bureau, operatives from the Muslim Brotherhood's Jamaat-e-Islami, officers from Saudi intelligence, and Arab volunteers from a dozen countries, was moving systematically to wipe out his rivals in Afghanistan ahead of the Soviet withdrawal. Like Archer Blood, whose telegram documenting Pakistan Army atrocities in Bangladesh had no effect on Nixon, McWilliams was ignored. The Reagan administration wanted to celebrate its triumph against the Soviets, not worry about what Pakistan might do next. McWilliams was sent back to Washington a few months later, as Afghanistan descended into civil war soon after the Soviet withdrawal. US assistance to Pakistan was suspended in 1990 after George H.W. Bush failed to certify, as required by the Pressler Amendment, that Pakistan did not possess nuclear weapons. The collapse of the Soviet Union by 1991 significantly decreased US interest in both Afghanistan and Pakistan until the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001. Ironically, the origins of those terrorist attacks could be traced to the radical Islamist groups that had been raised and trained in Pakistan with covert US funds.